Hi, everyone. I'm Maggie McGrath, senior editor at Forbes. Late Thursday, former CNN anchor Don Lemon was arrested by federal officials in connection with his coverage of a protest at a Minnesota church earlier this month. Another journalist and two other individuals were also arrested. And joining us to discuss this incident is Katherine Jacobsen. She is a program coordinator with the Committee to Protect Journalists. Katherine, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So, for folks who may not have seen Don Lemon's live stream earlier this month, I want to summarize briefly. He goes live, he's in like kind of a parking lot. He walks into a church where a group is protesting the ICE occupation of Minneapolis. He several times identifies himself as a journalist. You hear him in the video say, I'm not a protester, I'm a journalist. He interviews a protester, he interviews a pastor at that church. And it appears that it's this video that has led to his arrest. Is my summary of this situation correct?
That's correct to my understanding, yes. Don Lemon, along with Georgia Fort, a local reporter in the Minneapolis area, they were both arrested in relation to their coverage of this protest, as you said.
And how often is it in America and in your time at CPJ, have you seen reporters arrested in a situation like this?
It's highly unusual to see this type of arrest of a journalist, two journalists, after the fact. We've seen journalists arrested at protests quite a bit. During the 2020 George Floyd protests in Minneapolis, for example, there were quite a few arrests of journalists, right, and related to their reporting or in relation to their reporting. But to see after a protest, federal officials go after journalists in this way to serve search warrants or to serve warrants to them, it's highly unusual and incredibly concerning. I'll also add that the limited number of cases that, in relation to journalists being on private property and then being arrested or served warrants after the fact, have been handled at the state level. So to see, the federal government involved to this degree at this level is very odd, unusual, and disturbing, quite frankly.
Odd, unusual, and disturbing. Now, this protest was in a church, which seems to be the crux of the federal government's arguments. The Department of Homeland Security has told other news outlets that Don Lemon is being charged with conspiracy to deprive rights, violation of interfering with someone's First Amendment rights, i.e., the worshipers who were at this church. What does CPJ, what do you and your colleagues have to say about these charges? Are journalists allowed to go into places of worship in the middle of open services to do live interviews in the way that this happened? Or is it the fact that there was a protest that was entering that allowed for the journalistic coverage in that moment?
The journalists were following the news, right? And I think that's the important thing to note here, right? They were performing their work, right? It's and very much entitled, they were very much entitled to do so under the First Amendment, right? Which guarantees freedom of the press. We also have freedom of religion, right? And in no way was their reporting activity interfering with the church proceedings, right? The protest would have happened whether or not they were covering it or not, to our understanding. And so to conflate journalistic activity with something else is alarming and quite frankly shows a deep misunderstanding of the role that reporters play, which is informing the public about what's happening.
Now, Lemon at one point was wearing a beanie that looked like it identified his independent media outlet. But the two journalists that we're talking about here, Don Lemon and Georgia Fort, are independent journalists. And I know it's impossible to speculate that if they'd been with the AP or with Forbes or had been wearing large press vests, if this would have happened. But can you talk about whether or not the identification as someone as press would have made a difference in these scenarios?
It's difficult to say because, it's a kind of a post-factual, right? However, Don Lemon did identify himself as we said at the beginning, right, as a member of the press. And it doesn't really matter after the fact, right? Because the fact of the matter is the individuals who brought charges against these journalists very easily could have used Google to find out that they were in fact reporters. They chose not to do so, right? We're not talking about arrests that happened in on the spot in the moment when those types of confusions are more common. This arrest occurred after the protest had already concluded, and after two different judges had rejected the Justice Department's attempt to arrest Lemon and one of his producers, right? So the fact that, again, there was that much time to do proper research into who these individuals were really shows that the what I would say is attempt to silence speech versus to actually respect freedom of the press and journalists' ability to carry out their function.
You raise a good point, which is there had been an investigation almost immediately after the protest and Lemon's coverage of it. No charges were pressed then. Do we know what happened in the ensuing week to 10 days? Why now? Do we have a clear answer?
The Justice Department decided to ultimately pursue charges through a grand jury, right? Which is not a typical way of going about these types of arrests, again, especially of journalists. To go back to an earlier point, right? Anytime a journalist, in previous cases when journalists have been accused of trespassing on public property, that's usually handled at the state level. And instead, we have the federal government, a grand jury, in fact, involved in this, which is highly irregular. I hope that more information will come out soon about why this happened in this way, but it seems like the Justice Department failed to convince two other judges, both a federal magistrate judge and a federal appeals court judge, to move these charges forward.
Is this a politically motivated arrest?
Intent is difficult to ascribe always, but certainly the way the administration has framed this and their seeming lack of regard for regular legal proceedings and precedent as far as treatment of journalists goes certainly would indicate that this is highly irregular, abnormal, and uh, should be deeply concerning, I think, to see so many legal processes and which have been put into place for a reason to protect civil liberties, to see all of those ignored.
Now, Catherine, we're speaking in an age where and more journalists have gone independent in the way that Don Lemon has, whether through force, through layoffs, or because they want to. Does CPJ provide different guidance for those who are within the bounds of a more established newsroom versus independent journalists, i.e., should independent journalists, for their own safety, not be covering these protests, or should it be that the same rules apply to everyone?
The same rules should apply to everyone, right? Everyone should be entitled, all journalists should be entitled to the same rights guaranteed to the rights guaranteed under the First Amendment, right? Just because someone doesn't work for a legacy publication doesn't mean that they aren't performing an active journalism or informing the public of something that is of newsworthiness, right? Increasingly because of the strains of the journalism industry and the changes really to the journalism industry, we've seen a lot more reporters who are going independent, who are freelancers all the time, right? Or who are freelancers. And to say that their work is less valid or less valuable to our understanding as an American public, to what's going on in this country, it would be false, right?
This arrest also comes as the latest action by the Trump administration that is not exactly friendly towards journalists. We saw journalists get kicked out of the Department of Defense unless they signed that waiver earlier last year. We saw just last night, according to reports from Variety, members of the press were not allowed into the screening of the Melania movie. Several were allowed on the red carpet, but there were some that were excluded from the actual screening. And individually, some of these instances might not sound like a big deal, but can you give our audience a sense of collectively what this all means, what it signals to the citizens of this nation about press freedom in America?
Yeah, for so long, I think we as Americans have taken our democracy for granted. We've taken freedom of the press for granted, and knowing that we would be able to get information from a plurality of different sources, right? Those days are over in a way. American exceptionalism, as far as freedom of the press goes, no longer exists. What we are seeing now is an authoritarian playbook being put into action to control uh, information about what this administration is doing. Uh, these are not normal times, right? And I think if any of these things might have happened in a previous administration when there weren't these kind of flurry of executive actions trying to control and trying to centralize power, we would be having a different conversation. But the fact of the matter is, when you put all of these together and kind of you can tell what is going on. As the Committee to Protect Journalists, we're an international organization, and we have seen this playbook before. And the path that we are on is not a good one. Journalists are frequently, and the state of journalism is frequently kind of the canary in the coal mine, if you will, for the health of a democracy. And the state of American democracy, the state of American journalism is not good.
The state of American journalism, the state of American democracy is not good. That is a sober warning. And I also wonder, I recognize what you say about the age of American exceptionalism when it comes to press freedom being over. What does that mean for journalists in other countries? You referenced that CPJ is an international organization, and you regularly publish the lists of countries that are most dangerous for journalists, where journalists are jailed for months, years at a time. If journalists in America are being arrested, what does that mean for those countries where conditions were already dangerous for reporters?
Yeah, they're at even greater risk, I would say, because the United States has long been a traditional ally to freedom of the press and an advocacy ally, really, for those hoping to help journalists in difficult situations or seek justice and accountability for them overseas. And the fact of the matter is, the United States is no longer an advocate for press freedom in that way, and indeed, uh, we no longer have the type of press freedom that we enjoyed for so many years at home. We are living in a new safety paradigm. However, I will say that it's important for Americans and American journalists to look overseas and see examples of how journalists in other countries have handled declining democracy in their homes and how they have continued to report and document what's going on in their home countries.
Now, of course, my bias here is as a journalist, I find my fellow reporters trustworthy, but that is not necessarily the baseline case in America. And there are people, I am sure, who saw today's news and thought, yeah, that makes sense. He was arrested. Journalists are biased and don't tell the truth, and we can't trust the mainstream media. We've seen public polling around this, around public trust in the mainstream media. What is your message to those who might be following this news story and thinking, yeah, it's about time a journalist was arrested, or of course, journalists can't be trusted?
I would say, how do they find out about what's happening in their home communities? Do they care about the price of eggs, the price of gas, or how much their taxes are and how their tax dollars are being spent? And if the answer is yes, which I would assume it is, then they should care about journalists, especially local reporters, because journalists are serve as this kind of watchdog or accountability mechanism, really. That's what journalism does at its core, is keep government officials into account. And so I think it's a really important moment for the American public more broadly to take stock of what they are losing when freedom of the press is no longer guaranteed, and also to take stock of what narratives they're listening to, right? And who is benefiting from certain narratives versus others. And indeed, I think what's been in Minneapolis on the ground, we've seen how video footage of what is actually happening, how solid local reporting is helping people to understand the impact of deploying federal immigration agents in communities, and what that looks like, really. And I think this is perhaps, hopefully, a turning point for Americans to understand both the bigger picture of what the federal government is currently doing and how our tax dollars are being spent, and also, the role that journalists play in getting that information out.
Now, earlier today, CPJ did an online seminar about press freedom in the wake of this news that Don Lemon and Georgia Fort had been arrested by federal authorities. What else are you and your colleagues doing right now, and what do the coming days and weeks look like for your work?
Yeah, I think we are trying to help journalists in a variety of different ways. Part of this is making sure journalists have the safety guidance they need, the legal resources they need, and kind of connecting the dots there, as well as talking with reporters about mental health and kind of the aftercare of going out and covering these very difficult topics. And yeah, and I think that there is a very important role to be played by naming a problem and advocating for things to change, right? So frequently, if we don't call something out and don't point to ways that we can actually change and build bridges, perhaps also with non-traditional partners, um, change doesn't happen. It doesn't occur because people will be siloed. And I think that's our role as the Committee to Protect Journalists is to really help people understand the bigger picture of what's going on and also what could be lost if freedom of the press is not upheld.
You make an interesting point there about change. And some of the critiques of Lemon's reporting that I have heard is that he has strayed, or at least in some of those videos, strayed from neutral observer to advocate. What is your response to that criticism? And is he still protected by the First Amendment if, in a moment of reporting, he asks questions that sound like it could be from another protester?
The First Amendment protects the freedom of speech, point blank, as well as freedom of the press, right? And so there's a great degree of wiggle room there when someone is going out and reporting, right? Um, yeah.
Any other thoughts or anything else that you want the Forbes audience to know as this issue unfolds? Obviously, this news is still fresh, and I'm sure there will be updates over the coming hours and days, and if not weeks. But is there anything we haven't covered that you think is important for people to keep in mind as they follow this story?
Yeah, I just want to remind people that they have agency in this, right? The federal government is working for the American people, and sometimes we forget that. And I think it's really important to reflect on what we want our communities to look like and what we want our federal government to be doing for us. And is going after two journalists useful? Is that furthering conversation, or is that obfuscating what is going on in certain situations and detracting from other narratives that we're currently seeing in the U.S.? And so I think that's really the important thing that people need to remember is seeing the forest through the trees and seeing who benefits from the suppression of speech and attacks on journalists.
Katherine Jacobsen, Program Director at the Committee to Protect Journalists, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for your insights, and we thank CPJ, as always, for their work.
Thanks for having me.